Can I just close this one?
Yeah.
Honestly, yes. And no, yeah. The way we kind of hard there. Get started in the
Guys, why don't we switch your microphones off, on, I mean, so that we don't forget later. Yeah. What's that? You think they'll remember? Okay. Okay. All right, guys. Sorry, I should sit a little bit closer. Welcome. Very happy to see relatively many people here, given that the time slot also overlaps with this Article 6 negotiations. So we appreciate those of you who are here. And we're also recording the session in order to be able to share it afterwards for those that are maybe particular for those who are in the Article 6 negotiations right now. So welcome to those of you who are here to this session on grassroots perspectives on carbon markets. We have a bit of a packed agenda, as you can see. I'm joined by a few speakers. So I want to say at the outset, though, that before we begin, I want to say that the organizers of this side event don't support carbon markets, as we don't consider it climate action or climate finance. But given that the markets are being implemented, we do need to navigate them. So the fact that we are organizing this side event shouldn't be interpreted as a sort of a thumbs up on Article 6. We still think that we should prioritize domestic emissions reductions. So that was a little disclaimer from the lawyer among us. So today we will hear the community perspective, right? We will hear from 5 speakers, and they'll talk primarily about communities that are impacted by the projects that generate carbon credits. The main focus is on the Article 6 markets, but we'll also hear a bit on the voluntary carbon markets. And the speakers will talk about grassroots level reality. They'll talk about impact, they'll talk about rights, they will talk about benefit sharing, and they'll also talk about power imbalances and sometimes colonial dynamics that underpin these markets. So we're going to start with a presentation by Isa Mulder, who knows everything about Article 6. I've made that joke so many times, I'm not going to make it again, but I call her the Article 6 queen. She will give an overview of the relevant procedural frameworks of Article 6. And then we'll hear from 3 panelists who will focus on community experiences. And they are, maybe I'll just introduce them now. Yes, so we have Nika Rivera, who's a land rights coordinator at the Asian Farmers Association, and she will talk about insights from a wind farm project in the Philippines. And then we have Kwame, who's a campaign coordinator at the Global Forest Coalition, and he will discuss the first carbon credits under Article 6.4 from a project in Myanmar. And then we have Anne, who is a senior environmental justice officer at Namati and the Global Justice Network, and she will address governance challenges in the voluntary carbon markets with case studies from Liberia, Zimbabwe, and Colombia. And then after the panel, we will hear from Ivan, who's a climate justice program manager at IBON International in the Philippines. And he will sort of help us zoom out and look at carbon markets from a broader perspective and sort of situate it in global climate action. So I think that's it. Hopefully, if I manage the time well, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So Isa, without further ado, go ahead.
Thank you, Anja. So I want to start us off with just a stage setter, because I see some people in the room who have been following Article 6 very closely, but maybe others less so. So I want to make sure that we all understand Article 6 in the same way, and especially Article 6 when it comes to the implications of that framework for local communities and indigenous people. Because when we talk about Article 6.2 and 6.4, they're often being equated, but they're actually quite different frameworks, and I just wanted to highlight that. So Article 6.2 is an accounting and reporting framework, basically, for countries to trade mitigation outcomes, and to also account them towards their NDCs, potentially. So IPMOs, the term that you hear a lot in the Article 6 space, they can only be created through Article 6.2. However, how countries create IPMOs, that's basically up to them. So they can use different rule sets or standards, and Article 6.4 is one of those. It's a full-fledged carbon crediting mechanism with centralized requirements as well, but countries can also opt for other frameworks. They can opt for existing standards on the voluntary carbon market or domestic frameworks such as the JCM, and they can also just create their own arrangements in their bilateral or sometimes unilateral cooperative approaches. All they have to do for Article 6.2 is they have to report on it, and there's no quality bar, so to say, within Article 6.2. This also means that for Article 6.2, there's no quality bar for any provisions that relate to the rights and role of communities and indigenous people. It all depends on what underlying arrangements countries choose to generate these. Next slide, please. And so this slide is a little bit botched, sorry for that. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what requirements are currently in place for both Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 that are especially relevant to the grassroots perspective, both in terms of how communities can engage and also what rights, how their rights are protected. And you see here that for Article 6.4, there are a lot of yes buts. So basically, that's reflecting that there are provisions in place on all of these elements, but these provisions are quite limited. And they're especially limited if you compare them to best practice, either on the voluntary carbon market or best practice in other relevant international frameworks, such as the Green Climate Fund or UNDRIP or the Cancun safeguards, etc. And so for Article 6.2, what you can see here, which may not be so surprising on the basis of what I just told you, is that there's a no on every element, since, as I explained, this depends entirely on what underlying arrangements countries choose to use for Article 6.2. So there's no universal safeguards. And then I wanted to highlight one aspect that I think is really important for Article 6.2, but actually also for 6.4, when it comes to land-based projects especially, which is that Article 6 is a UN party-driven carbon trading architecture, and because of that, a lot will come down to national laws and regulations. And there's actually a huge variability in how indigenous people and local communities are protected across the world. And this is a map of the tenure security of indigenous people and local communities based on data from Landmark. The maps are originally, they've created maps split out for indigenous people and then local communities, but I just merged them to get an overview here, but I really recommend checking out the original maps on their website. You can see that in some areas of the world, on average, indigenous people and local communities are have much better tenure security than in others. And the fact that how Article 6 plays out in different countries is quite dependent on national regulation means that this will have huge consequences for how in some countries negative consequences of or negative impacts arising from Article 6 will probably be much more pronounced than in other countries. So that's really, really important to keep in mind. Next slide. And yeah, I think from all of this, it's a very intro level, but it's just to get us on the same page, because I definitely want to hear more from people who come from the grassroots perspective than just from me. But I think this is just to start us off with the conclusion that the Article 6 framework does not provide universal and robust protections to indigenous people and local communities. And it doesn't provide the protections, but it really doesn't recognize them as agents with a right to self-determination. And this is especially an issue for Article 6.2, but it also is an issue under 6.4, which I think is not always highlighted in the same way. And if you want to learn more about this, because this was very quick, please do check out these publications. We have assessed the Article 6 rules in more detail in our By the Book publication. We have assessed the entire Article 6 rulebook, but in the other publication, we've looked into the Article 6.4 rules specifically for local communities and indigenous people. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isa, for giving us an overview of the procedural framework and also sort of hinting to the shortcoming and limitations of that framework. So now we turn to our panel. for sort of the grassroots community perspective. And we start with Nika.
Thank you. So I would like to share a few of our observations from our recent engagement with the indigenous communities in Botolan, Zambales in the Philippines. So this is in relation to the proposed Alba wind farm project. So this is a project that we went through with the Land Matrix Initiative, with Asian Farmers Association, and of course with the support of Carbon Market Watch. So this Alba wind farm is a proposed renewable energy project that has already been submitted under the PACAM. And according to some of the project disclosures that we've had, the project plans to install around 60 wind turbines, approximately across 4,698 hectares of land. And it will be sitting in the municipalities of Botolan and Cabangan in Zambales, and expected to generate approximately around 630,000 tons of emissions reductions each year. And an investment estimated at $600 million. So the project is also being developed in an area where it's occupied by the Aita indigenous community, whose relationship with the land and is being shaped by their long-standing connections to their forest, to the watershed, and to also their upland ecosystem. So the issues that were raised by the community members is that they touch on 3 specific areas that are highly relevant in our discussion for today. So they mentioned about the quality of information that were provided during the FPIC processes, the recognition and the customary and informal tenure rights that weren't discussed in a lot of the consultations with the project developer, and also the questions of remedy and accountability when harm already occurs in the project. So the first observation relates to the informed part of the free, prior, and informed consent. So that part of the component. So the community members told us when we went there that they had attended several meetings with the project developer, and they understood that a wind farm is being created, it was being proposed, but the discussions were focused primarily on the renewable energy component of the project. So during the consultations that we've had, the community members indicated that they had not discussed any of the potential participation in carbon markets, carbon credits, or at least the implications of those that may happen over the longer term. So there were no mentions. So it's for us, it's important because consultations alone, we do not see them that they demonstrate that FPIC has been achieved. So FPIC, it requires that IPs are able to understand the activity being proposed. They can discuss the implications of those within their communities through their own decision-making processes, and also they can decide whether or not to give their consent in that certain project. So the ITAs were very concerned beyond whether the meetings had taken place, and what they pertain to is that they do not have the sufficient information and opportunity to deliberate on the issues they consider important before the important decisions are being made about the project. So a second observation that we've had relating to participation, documentation, and also decision-making processes. So the Aita community shared to us that some of the documents prepared for endorsement by the local government and other actors had already been prepared in advance using a standard template. This raised concerns because the issues that mattered to them most has not been yet fully discussed, and yet it was pro forma templated and approved under the local government units. So the AITA, they express uncertainty regarding the location, the extent of the project. And when we saw the documents of this Botolan wind farm, they only referred to certain and specific coordinates and administrative locations. And there was no clear information as to available to the community regarding where are the exact boundaries of the project location of the proposed wind farm. And when we had the discussion with them about the discussion quickly moved beyond the discussion on coordinates, on administrative boundaries, and they spoke more about watersheds, gathering areas, the sacred sites. They they have, the burial grounds they have, and the forest areas that support their livelihoods and their cultural practices. So for the community, these places are not just a simple location on the map that you can put in a project document, but they are more tied to their history, their identity, and of course, their everyday survival. And that many of these places, many of these stories are not always reflected in a lot of these project documents, these technical studies being prepared, or even the formal land records that we have. And we see the importance of having tools like the community mapping and the community-led documentation, and how it can actually help address the gap by documenting how communities themselves understand and use their own territories. And these kinds of processes, they help them identify the concern. They can actually clarify the resource use and the customary boundaries that they have. And it can create a record that communities can rely on when concerns and remedy is needed at a later stage. No? And finally, I would like to touch on the discussions about remedy and accountability. So in a lot of the safeguard discussions, the attention is almost focused on consultation requirements and the grievance mechanism in those standards. But the communities that we work with, they are often asking a very different question. So what happens if the information that was provided was incomplete? What will happen if the commitments are not fulfilled? And what will happen if harm occurs? So they raise these concerns regarding the potential impacts on the water resources, their access to livelihoods, forest. Those questions are very important. And what will happen if they do not materialize? No? So in this instance, when they're being asked to endorse documents that are pro forma, templated, before the key issues were fully disclosed and discussed, the remedy is very difficult later on, because the concerns were never recorded, they were never negotiated, they were never reflected in the project documentation, and it's often harder for the communities to raise their concerns once the implementation of the project begins. So it's not just that the remedy is not just about compensation, but also how to do and deal with it when harm occurs. So it was very clear in the discussions that we've had in the ITA community that they don't need more and more consultations. So they wanted the information that they could understand in a language that they understand, documentation that also reflected their own personal concerns and the concerns of their community, and the assurance that their rights, their livelihoods, and their cultural heritage would remain protected throughout the life cycle of these projects being proposed, and even beyond these projects proposed. So I'll end with saying that we have discussed during our exchanges with them, there were very practical concerns that they raised, no? But of course, the concerns are exactly what the heart of free, prior, and informed consent is all about, what participation is all about, what remedy and accountability is all about. So they are all, and they should be central to the mechanism that is being proposed, such as the Article 6. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mika, for that colorful rendition of the Philippine case. We'll come back and discuss more after, but right now I want to hand over to Kwame, who will talk about a project in Myanmar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. The previous speakers talked about the concern of Article 6 that will lead to exploitation of indigenous peoples. So I'm here to summarize quickly the report that Global Forest Coalition conducted with other organizations on carbon credit project in Myanmar. So it titles Carbon Credit Under Fire, Myanmar Crimes Against Humanity and the crisis of credibility facing UN high integrity carbon markets. So just to say that it's a small project, but it's highly significant because it's the first project that was accredited under UNFCCC Article 6 Paris Agreement, the mechanism. So it's online. You can read it, and then you can see yourself what is there. So the reports, Carbon Credits Under Fire, investigate a cook stove carbon offsets projects in Myanmar, coordinated by the South Korea NGOs Climate Change Center. It's a South Korean organization. So the timing of the project is critical. It's critical because, as I said, it's the first project, and it started in 2021, and just after 1 month, there was a coup, attempted coup. So the junta take over, and then because of that coup, the resulting conflict has led to widespread violence, nearly 100,000 deaths, and the displacement of almost 4 million people. And the conflict has involved serious human rights abuses, including alleged war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. An international crime court's arrest warrant was issued against the junta leader, Min Aung. Just to lead you to understand the context first, and then I'll come back on the issue. And so, despite the coup, the project continued under the government that was taken over by the junta. And the main partner of the project is the Ministry of Natural Resource and Environment Conservation. And that ministry continue the implementation of the projects, and during that period, the first credit issuance covered that period, and it's important also to note that the colonel Kim Mong, who is the minister that who is the minister that time implementing the project, was sanctioned by the European Union and for supporting the military regime. Next slide. So many of the project's implementation area were located in Myanmar and Central Dry Zone, including Sangin region, which became a major center of resistance to military rule, and one of the areas most severely affected by violence after 2021 coup. So these regions experience widespread violence, displacement, sexual and gender-based violence, and attack on civilians. So despite the severity of the conflicts, monitoring report for the project did not mention either the coup or ongoing conflicts. So conflict data from ACLED, an independent and trusted conflict monitor, shows that the 27th township area of the project experienced numerous violence accidents during the monitoring period, for which Article 6.4 credits were approved, with some areas experiencing particularly a high level of violence. So the conflict data further shows that the period covered by the first issuance of credits coincided with the peak of political violence in the project area, based on both incident numbers and facilities. So given the scale of violence, displacement, food insecurity, and human rights abuses in the project area, serious questions arise about whether the project's activities could be effectively implemented monitored, and independently verified. So no on-site verifications visits were conducted. So the verification company received an exemption due to the security concerns and relied instead on limited visits to Yangon and a small number of Zoom interviews with stove users, raising concern about the credibility of the verification process. So the report also questioned the environmental integrity of the credit. Previous analysis suggested the project may have been substantially overcredited under the clean development mechanism, while more recent analysis indicates that overcrediting may still persist under Article 6.4 because of the flaws in the methodology. So the report highlights concerns about gender exploitation, although the project claims to benefit women and girls. It depends on women unpaid labor while operating in areas where women continue to face disproportionate impacts from conflicts, insecurity, and gender-based violence. So the project illustrates a disconnect between claims of high integrity carbon markets and realities on the ground. It raises broader concerns about how climate finance mechanism interacts with governance failures, human rights abuses, and social inequities. So the Myanmar Cookstove project serves as a warning about the risks of carbon markets approaches that may shift burdens to communities already affected by conflicts and injustices. So the report is clear on the fact that effective climate solutions should be community-led and socially accountable. So the report calls on the supervisory body of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism to immediately suspend any further issuance, transfer, or use of credit associated with the Myanmar projects. It also calls for an independent review of the project's compliance with all relevant methodological, environmental, and social requirements. Finally, the report recommends revoking all credits already issued and disqualifying the project from future participation in the review finds that it failed to meet required standards or that its emission reduction cannot be reliably verified. So it's very important to get the report. It's online. Get it, and then you understand more the outcomes of the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwame. And the link is up there. The report is easy to find. So we've heard from Nika about a wind farm project where the community was affected in one way, and then a very different case from Kwame from Myanmar. It was a cook stoves project that had different challenges and issues. And now we will hear from Anne, who will take us to the voluntary carbon market. But of course, even though it is a different market, there are parallels that can be drawn. So go ahead, Anne.
Thank you, Anja. I think the previous speakers have really brought out what I wanted to start with, and that is like the recurring governance challenges within the voluntary carbon markets. And I think there is sort of consensus, and I know consensus is an interesting word to use within the context of carbon markets, but I think there's a lot of consensus on the key issues that are all the problematic issues within carbon markets. So if we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, inadequate benefit sharing, lack of accountability, and weak accountability and lack of oversight, I think that's something that within even what the previous speakers have shared are issues that have, like people agree that this is what has been happening. Now, members of our network have experienced the same thing. So in Liberia, there was a carbon project known as the Blue Earth Capital that was spanning over 69,000 hectares of forest land. And the project developer worked with only one single clan instead of working with all the other clans. And the reason why he did not work with the other clans, it is because they did not have registered land rights. And so this was the only clan that had registered land rights was the only one that they did engage. Of course, that brought a lot of problems because there were other communities who had customary land rights who were not recognized. I moved to Zimbabwe, where the same case, a similar case on lack of adequate benefit sharing. I know it's a really famous case, but it really brought forth the Zimbabwe carbon markets framework that is there right now. I moved to Colombia, the Pira Parana case. So here, the project developer did not consult the Indigenous Council, which is one, it's like the highest governing body within the community. And so the communities came together, they went to court, and they did get a good judgment. But one of the things that was said in the judgment is that it is important for a national law to be there on carbon markets to provide safeguards. Otherwise, there will be a recurrence of these kind of cases. And that brings me to my next point on safeguards. When you talk about safeguards, there's usually a general agreement that there has to be free, prior, and informed consent. We have to respect land rights. We have to ensure there's benefit sharing. There's that consensus, but the issue and the silence comes on the how. What specifically do we mean when we say free, prior, and informed consent? In the context of carbon markets, what kind of information should be available? How should it be made available? And how do we ensure that consent is given, especially when you think about a lot of carbon projects, they span over so many communities. So it's big projects, and we want to grant free, prior, and informed consent. How do we ensure that actually happens? And that is also practically feasible within the context of, how carbon markets operates. When it comes to customary land rights protection, how do we ensure that unregistered customary claims are recognized, but also at the same time are identified? When it comes to equitable benefit sharing, what is adequate? Is it 10%? Is it 40%? Is it 90%? What is a feasible percentage? What information do communities need to have at the end of the year? I normally use this example of if you're in a partnership agreement with someone and you're sharing in profits, you need to know what is there in the financial statement. Your partner can't just come and say, we made a loss, there's nothing to share. You have to have access to those statements and to be able to interpret what they mean and if the money that you receive actually is the same as the money that you ought to have received. Now, I'll move from the sad story to a very brilliant and a wonderful story that we celebrate that happened last year. So we were supporting communities in Sierra Leone to negotiate a carbon project agreement with a project developer known as West Africa Blue. Now, these communities are 220 communities, and it is in Sitia Chiefdom in Bonth district within Sierra Leone. And at the end of the day, the communities were able to negotiate and get an agreement where they will be sharing 40% of the gross revenue. And then there are other provisions when it comes to how the revenue will be managed, how they will be involved in the ongoing management and participation of the project. But I think when I look at this particular case, I think several things led to the success of this. Number one, there was a shared objective between the project developer and the communities. And one of the things that really was important, I think, for the project developer was to ensure that there's success. Because one of the things that sometimes when we talk about for instance, free, prior, and informed consent, the key question is usually that, oh, it's expensive, these communities are many, how do we go about this? But I think we forget the flip side. The flip side is if we don't meaningfully involve them, and they are the ones who are stewarding these resources, they are the ones who are within the project area, then there's a likelihood that there will be no success of this particular project, and the money you are preserving or trying to be cost effective so as not to have adequate FPIC is going to be lost perhaps when you go to litigation or the project is suspended at the end of it all. And I think there was the inclination that the project developer came with was very important. But another aspect is that these communities had independent legal and technical support from us, which is not something that most communities usually have. And so when, for instance, we had proposed to get I think it was 65% of the gross revenue. And then they presented a counter offer. And within the counter offer, one of the things they was talking about is issues around financial viability and all that. So you can imagine if it was a community that did not have independent legal and technical support, how would they be in a position to counter offer that and to be able to, because then the thing would be maybe perhaps say, oh, it's okay, it's fine, give us, the percentage that's available. And so then that was really important. There are other factors that I will not get into that were really instrumental when it came to having the success of this particular project. There was a QR code there and you can read more about it. So the next one is, as I conclude, is to share that based on the experiences and the case studies that I have shared here, we have developed 2 toolkits. Number one is a toolkit for grassroots justice advocates and communities on how to negotiate with carbon project developers. It provides the nuances when it comes to the kind of information you need. It also goes deeper into these case studies and some of the lessons that communities have learned when they were engaging with carbon project developers. And a disclaimer, this tool is not just for them to know how to say yes and to go on with the project, but it also teaches communities on how to say no and where there's red flags and what would be the red flags look like. And the other toolkit is on how national legislation can advance carbon justice, because when you talk about the context of Article 6, national law is quite important, but also I think especially there's a section on a checklist that provides a checklist for what I was saying, like if it's free, prior, and informed consent, what specifically should be in a law to be able to be robust. And I think taking that even in the context of independent carbon standards or even within the context of Article 6 is really important so that then we achieve the level of specificity that is will be great enough to ensure that the rights are safeguarded, as opposed to having top-line messages or top-line, we have FPIC mentioned in a law, but it's not detailed enough to offer protection. So I'll end it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. And what a perfect bridge to the discussion, because you focus there at the end on what communities can actually do and what other stakeholders can do in order to support communities on the grassroots level. So I wanted to hear a little bit more hear your reflections on meaningful FPIC, right? What does it mean? What is required for consent to be meaningful and valid? And those changes, the changes that you think need to happen, do they need to happen on the UN level? Like here, do we need revisions to the SD tool under Article 6.4? Or do we perhaps need to focus more on capacity strengthening and supporting communities like you're talking about, Anne, or maybe both, right? How do we balance the different ways of getting the grassroots voices heard and taken into account in a meaningful way in the carbon markets? So this is just an open question to all of you. But short answers, please. Yeah, go ahead.
So at least for us, we have a framework that we're working on. We work on it at the ASEAN level. It's called the ASEAN FPIC Handbook. It's a guideline, and it's a very important guideline for us because it was actually created by indigenous peoples organizations, by local communities, and how they see FPIC should happen in the national legislations. And one important aspect of that is that they decide what they want and what they want to see, how it happens, the timeline, the language, everything is being decided for them. Because there's a lot of discussions also, and also mentioned about this, that how many percentage would you say that FPIC is acceptable? But why are we asking these questions ourselves? We should ask them, what is the percentage, or not even percentage, because in a lot of local communities, there's no percentage that is being discussed. It's actually a decision that they have within the customary systems that they have. So to be able to respect that kind of systems and governance is to be able to honor what FPIC is all about. So I think that should be at the center of the FPIC discussions in all levels, not just consultation. You cannot ever equate consultation as a consent. So I think that's an important aspect of FPIC, because when they see consultation happen, oh, FPIC happened. So that's very important. So yeah.
Thank you.
Just to add,
Yeah.
just to add quickly, I think it's very important at this time to understand that communities lack the understanding of FPIC, and there is no much capacity building on FPIC. And the FPIC process happens most of the time on the top for the leaders in the communities. So sometimes it's not going into women, those who are on the ground suffering. So the consent should be widely agreed by the whole community, not only the chief or two notable or two or three leaders on FPIC. I think it's very important to build more capacity for communities to understand the process, and also for the government and the project coordinators to understand, or project managers to understand that the C is not just consultation, it's the consent, and the communities has right to say no or yes. And sometimes they go to the community for the intention just to grab yes from communities. That's why some communities have military. They are intimidated by military to oblige them to say yes. Yeah.
Can I push a little bit further on that though? So in terms of like, how do we make that happen? Do we need, so Nika, you talked about national legislation. Do we also need, and we've already, and Kwame have both talked about the importance of strengthening communities. But if we, since, you know, not all national governments will have an interest in enacting this type of legislation, maybe you, Isa, like, does this need to be a requirement in the Article 6.4 framework, the procedural framework, or broadly?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, especially because like you said, it's not in all countries that this framework is either existing or will plan to exist very soon. So yeah, I do think there's huge steps to be made at the international level as well, and the 6.4 framework is a really good starting point for that. Actually, there is already one of the principles of the SD tool, which is the safeguarding framework for 6.4, is indigenous peoples and their right to FPIC. However, this principle, it's quite in its in how it plays out in practice. It isn't really clear, and I think it really touches on all of the issues that were mentioned by the other panelists, and also what Nika described is a project happening under Article 6.4, or like that is intending to credit under Article 6.4. And so they're following the process in theory, but in practice, you see that how those rules are understood and how they're applied in practice, it's actually really limited. And the issue is that this wouldn't necessarily lead to the project being rejected. So there needs to be a much more rights-based approach to the rules, to the safeguards, to FPIC, to other safeguards for Article 6.4 in order to them to serve as an effective framework for actually upholding these rights. But I think that should be done at that level because also participation under Article 6.4, it's voluntary, right? So countries don't have to participate if they don't want to follow those rules. But if they do, then there should be a universal sort of standard set of rights, and it shouldn't vary per country because that means that it will likely also become a race to the bottom if that leads to cheaper credits, for example. So I would really like to see more under Article 6.4 happen, and I think there maybe will be some movement on that in the coming months, hopefully.
Thank you. And you're very far away from me, so I couldn't see if you wanted to get in on this point or not on further on FPIC.
Maybe to just add a little bit when it comes to like whether we need national law or the sustainable development tool. I think we need both. And when you think about the sustainable development tool, I think there's still some countries who are really still developing their own laws and their own policies. So in a situation where there is a project on Article 6.4 and we do not have very strong safeguards with the SD tool, then it will be problematic for communities. And one of the things we have been proposing for the SD tool is the use of applicable law. So where there's like international law and there is national law, the one that offers the greatest protection should be the one that supersedes to really be able to protect communities. So I think there is a place definitely for the sustainable development tool to provide even like the norm that even countries can be able to borrow from for those countries that are yet to like legislate, even for those that want to strengthen their already existing laws. Yeah, and for FPIC, I think it's just, especially on the information, breaking down the kind of information that needs to be provided for communities and at what point they should be provided.
Thank you. And you actually raised something else, which is, there are different levels of rules, right? There's national law, there's international law, there's the SD tool under Article 6.4. But rules are only good if they're enforced and if they are, if actors can be held accountable to those tools. So very briefly, whose responsibility is it? I think this is a very open question, but maybe is there also a responsibility on the buyer countries or maybe on corporations in the voluntary carbon markets, right, to make sure that the rules are actually followed? What do you guys think? Yeah, go ahead. Very briefly, and then we're going to move on to Iman.
Yeah, definitely. The accountability is not just for the government. Of course, the government as the state, they should be held accountable to create those national laws that will protect local communities. But also the buyer countries is very important to look at all these mechanisms that they are engaging with, especially now that we are in a perfect time that the 6.4 is actually being reviewed. No, so this is the time that we also listen to these kinds of experiences that we have seen in the VCS, in the previous mechanisms that we have, and look at all of these projects that are happening, because although they are different mechanisms in itself, they are not operating in a certain vacuum. They are all operating in a land-based, or for example, in an area where there are issues on land tenure security, there are issues where indigenous peoples and local communities are not even being labeled as indigenous communities. Therefore, they don't have the protection of FPIC to use. And how do you actually protect local communities who are outside of the FPIC provision? So those questions should also be asked, not just by governments who are selling, but also who are buying the credits as well. And this is the time, SB, the COPs, to continue these engagements.
Great. Very briefly, we have time for one more. Okay. quick.
Okay,
and
so there
like
should be also it's very important to link all the conventions and agreements under CBD, for instance. Communities are organized, and some of the communities have their protocols, and it's very important to have that protocols reinforced by the national laws, and also be clear that if the government is into the voluntary market, there should be a global or a national view on how to protect communities. It's not just profits. Nature is doing its job already. So if you want to put money on nature, it should be something that can be taken secondarily. And the protection of communities is very, very important.
Thank you. Anne, last word on this.
I think it's also important for the buyers to conduct due diligence when they are buying the credits, to understand the project, to understand the impacts of the project on communities before they do buy. But in terms of how to hold the buyers accountable, I think one problem we face is that there's such fragmented governance when it comes to carbon markets generally. So like, for instance, for buyers, there's like the SBTI, which provides for like sort of like guidelines for buyers, or the ICVCM, but most of the times it's more voluntary for buyers to be able to comply with those guidelines, and most of the times it's the incentives, mostly reputation, that maybe may drive them to get that. But thinking through what other incentives are important to have, so that then this governance or these guidelines that already exist can be able to be put into use, because like the SBTA has really good guidelines that buyers can abide by, and that will help them to be accountable. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we could keep discussing. There will be 15 minutes for Q&A, so we can continue the discussion in a direction of your choice. But first, we will hear from Ivan, who will sort of zoom out and help us look at carbon markets, or view carbon markets in a broader context of global climate action and just transition.
All right, thank you, Anja, for the opportunity to join this very important conversation on carbon markets. Actually, my input is more of an appreciation of the presentations of our dear colleagues, and for me, they strongly demonstrate, at least for our organization that I'm part of, they demonstrate our fundamental opposition to the idea of carbon markets, of carbon credits, and carbon trading. It was the geographer and social theorist David Harvey who introduced the concept of accumulation by dispossession, and he used it to explain how capitalism continuously creates new avenues for profit, and it does so not only by the traditional labor exploitation, extracting value from workers' labor, but also by privatizing and commodifying public assets and the commons. And for us, hearing this discussion, carbon markets are an instantiation of this accumulation by dispossession expounded by David Harvey. And we see it when common resources, such as land, water, forests, and even the means of basic subsistence in the global south become commodified and privatized, traded with transaction fees, and allocated and regulated by international and state institutions under conditions of an equal exchange between developed and developing countries, northern companies, and southern communities. And this neocolonial dynamic is also what drives the financialization of carbon credits. Corporations and private equities, private equity firms buy, hold, and resell phantom credits. And because of this, vast tracts of land in the global south are being acquired by foreign entities for carbon sequestration, dispossessing indigenous peoples and the rural poor. And so while, we also agree, and we, of course, accompany our colleagues in their advocacy to ensure that negotiations on carbon markets and carbon trading minimize human rights harms, and protect the agency and sovereignty of indigenous peoples. We also talked about adequate profit sharing anchored on access to data and transparency. For us, we should also constantly be reminded and put into perspective that no safeguards or protocols can overturn this underlying logic of carbon markets and carbon trading, which is capitalist imperialism, accumulation by dispossession, and no guardrails really can make neocolonial green grabbing for our peoples and communities palatable. And so, what more fundamental actions can we do? Billions of dollars of public funds have been spent on carving out global agreements to peddle false solutions such as carbon markets. We have seen in countries such as Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Gabon, and this was actually documented in a research done by our colleagues in Global Forest Coalition, how precious domestic resources in these debt-ridden countries are being used to promote carbon trading, because Global South governments see selling carbon credits as their best option for adaptation mitigation or development finance or debt relief of any kind. And so for us, a critical component of our fight, of our struggle, is to shut off the spigot on carbon markets and other false solutions by divesting public funding from market-based solutions and redirecting climate finance and fiscal policy towards non-market approaches, such as those under Article 6.8, from just and equitable transition in the Global South, climate resilience of frontline communities, land redistribution and tenureship for landless farmers, and direct funding access to indigenous peoples and women, among many other real solutions that actually exist, no? The real solutions that are rights-based, gender-just, and people-driven. And for us, they are the only way to prevent catastrophic global climate change and not false solutions, and such as carbon trading and carbon markets. So that's my appreciation of the discussion so far. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ivan. I know I can always count on you to say it like it is. So thank you again for the unwavering clarity of your positions. Thank you. We now have a full 17 minutes for Q&A, and I'm happy to see that so many people have joined the room since we started. Jax, you have the microphone, right? So any burning questions to get us started? Yes, even walking toward the microphone. I love it.
Yes, thank you. I walked in from the back. My name is Olga Gasanzada. I'm one of the supervisory body members of Article 6.4. And actually, it's a bit unfortunate because there are 6.2 negotiations in finance are going on right now. But I was luckily able to leave somebody else from my delegation in the room, so I'm here. I just wanted to add a few comments, maybe make it a bit clearer, where, where we are together jointly. And I hear Ivan's comment. I think it's up to communities and host countries whether to allow carbon finance versus climate finance is a choice, obviously, that communities and countries have. I mean, my personal opinion as a professional is that there is really nothing. It's either this or nothing. And I worked on climate finance myself before. It's just relabeling of bank loans. So therefore, there is this community of people who is trying to make carbon markets work, but work them for local communities and for climate action. And that is a joint issue that we have as regulators and civil society, because they're intermediaries in this process. And then we need to create processes how we govern them together, so that these instruments that were created to channel finance into worthy causes towards the communities, that then they do not get abused. And I really appreciate the case studies that were brought up, from Myanmar, from the Philippines, from Africa. It's very important that that we hear of them, like that you channel them to us, because then we have a chance to discuss them as detailed as possible, the cases. I also wanted to assure you that the the issues have been so far, the issuance on Myanmar has been for the monitoring period where they had in-country visit. The first exemption was because there was an earthquake. And that was a humanitarian crisis that was kind of time limited. I'm not at liberty to comment. I can only say that there are members of the supervisory body that have seen this report and share the concerns. I think it would be helpful, though, if it's more clear, what's at fault with the project and what is just the situation. Because, like, I'm from Ukraine. War, conflict, violence is part of daily life, but life continues. And how do we structure these things in a way that, do we just not allow any projects in countries where there's war? That my personal opinion would be not, but we need to make sure that the project does not exacerbate the situation. And if there's any evidence the project has exacerbated the situation specifically, then there are mechanisms that have been already built in. And ESA knows them really, really well. We have the continuous local consultation that this concerns the FPIC issues. So this needs to be raised in these processes, if that there is input in the continuous local consultation process that the community has not received sufficient information and not in local language. And then the project developer has to respond to that and to verify, like there's a verifier who goes every monitoring period for every issuance. They have to verify what has been provided. And if it's not possible to do it through local stakeholder consultation, there's continuous global stakeholder consultation in the process. Where there's also revision of the sustainable development tool that's happening right now, and there'll be public consultation open on the 22nd of June. And we're really welcoming everyone to submit your inputs as detailed as possible with case studies and concerns. I heard Isa saying that, it's the 6.4 framework right now does not live up to the standard of, others like RED, and voluntary carbon markets. And that's also important. Like the more references that you can find of where the differences are, what exists somewhere, because it's a lot easier for us as supervisory members to shape something based on examples that already exist. And the cases that you have found, it's also very important for us because then it's not a theoretical discussion. It's a discussion, well, we see something happening like this, how do we prevent it? It's a bit complicated. What you mentioned on like people are not recognized as indigenous and FPIC, and what do we do? Like there is some thinking about it. It was in the public discussion that, that an FPIC equivalent and how we insert it into the decisions. But also if they're customary rights rather than recognized rights, it becomes complicated. And if there are any examples of how this is solved in other frameworks, that would be really, really helpful because, there are concerns by other members, that, it becomes a bit of like legitimizing something that's considered illegal, and like that is, but I'm sure that there've been attempts to try to solve this. And if there are examples of how it's been solved before, that would be really, really helpful. And I'll be here and happy to answer any questions that people have there.
Do any of the speakers want to comment on those remarks? Yeah, Nika, go ahead.
Thank you, Olga, for that. And we had also discussions on the side during the informal dialogues. No, but first, I agree with what you said in terms of FPIC. It's part of the recommendations that we've submitted on extending the consent-based safeguard. Of course, FPIC, it's an exclusive right of the indigenous peoples, and we understand that. And we also understand that there are complexities in other countries where they are not even recognized as IPs, but they have the same customary governance tenure system. So how do we protect that to extend those similar consent-based governance frameworks to them? But I think it's also a matter of discussing on pushing ourselves, everyone, to our negotiators to actually adopt those policies at the national level, because that's what will protect our communities. For example, having a FPIC guideline will be really helpful to when these kinds of projects come in, not just carbon projects in itself. It will help our communities to have those safeguards and to follow those procedures as well. But also, it doesn't end with having those guidelines. It should also happen at the level where communities have more access to these informations. For it, truth be told, it's really, really difficult. The language of 6.4, 6.2, it's really inaccessible. And just for us to be here, it's very expensive. To bring people to be here to say what is happening to their local communities, it's very expensive. And to make that more accessible for local communities, because that is their land. We have to shift the framing that we're coming in, we're experts, we get data from them, and then that's it. We have to come in and respect that there is authority in that specific land, and we come in as outsiders, and we have to understand what is happening within that. And with that respect, we also give them that space and respect to be part of these discussions and not just have a seat at the table, but actually have more meaningful participation. I don't know how that will happen, Olga, with 6.4, but I hope the accessibility in the language will really happen, because we want more people to be engaged in these systems. But thank you for all your comments.
Thank you so much, Nika. Can I just, before I give you the word, Kwame, can I see by show of hands, other questions in the room? Okay, you know what, Kwame, I'm really sorry, but we're gonna, I saw yours first in the back there, so go ahead, and then, yeah, two, okay. I will make it a toss, try to keep it short. And we'll take
Sure.
all the questions and then give this.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Alex Prado from WWF Brazil. And yeah, I have some questions here. First of all, I think that what we have in Brazil now is the worst case scenario. We have a lot of voluntary carbon and the RED projects, especially for RED Plus projects. And I like what you showed today, because at least looks like we have some kinds of views here. That's good. But I really think that we need to define the best. What is the best? What's the one that you can work with? Because the worst case scenario is that what's happening now. This is my opinion. So this is for a RED Plus project. But what do you think about the GRED projects, about the jurisdictional one that Brazil we are developing to? Not me, WWF, but other the states are doing that. And when you say carbon markets project is more than just RED Plus, I know that for communities, RED Plus is what is impacted it. But we have removals to restoration. That is something very important for us in Brazil when we are thinking our NDC commitments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, the man with the nice beard and the light shirt.
Yeah, thank you. Tom Goldtooth with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And in fact, part of the Durban group that met in 2004 in South Africa, along with other folks that were concerned about implementation of carbon trading, carbon markets. And it's interesting as we talk about FPIC, and I just want to be really quick here. Part of it is unpacking what has happened. The gentleman just spoke, you know. We know of most of the problems on implementation of the whole world carbon markets, carbon pricing, offsets, mechanisms. Yes. I see, though, there's still concerns in how we unpack where we've been, okay? And looking at engagement. I was involved with RED before it was RED Plus. I was involved with RED when there was just 1D, okay? When the forests weren't brought into a discussion as far as carbon sinks, okay? So my point is this, FPIC. There's still a lack of clarity on who has the responsibility for assuring the principles, the standards, the legal mechanism, however it's constructed, is carried out. And who has that responsibility? Okay, what's mentioned real quick now.
Very quick.
I followed 2 large NGOs who were pro-Red, Red Plus in Ecuador and Peru, as they go into communities to inform them about Red, free, prior, and informed consent. Following and going into the communities, I asked them, do you know where the money comes from? They did not have clarity in where the money comes from. A couple said the World Bank. But when I told them real quick, I know, real quick, I'm sorry.
To finish.
When I said it's coming from Chevron, the ones in Ecuador were insulted. They were upset because they're dealing with Chevron, okay, on cleanup. And knowing that the money comes from Chevron, which is very basic to understanding the key mechanism of Red, it's a violation, definitely. So real quick, I just put that question out. Yeah, thank you.
No, the question of what content, what information needs to be available is definitely central. I'm going to do this. I'm going to give each of the speakers 1 minute to respond to any one of those comments, or just tie up your main points. All right, Nika, go ahead. Go first.
Maybe just quickly on the FPIC aspect, I agree that there needs to be, for us to revisit what really FPIC is all about, because FPIC is being used so much in a lot of documents. It's being used as a reference in a lot of these standards. But what we see is that it's not taken into how it really is when it was being forwarded in the UN DRIP, when it was being it was a fight for our indigenous peoples organizations to be adopted, even in the CFS, the VGGTs, those very important frameworks. We have to always go back and understand what is really the messaging and what is the essence of all those guidance and frameworks that we are talking about, and then we go to these standards, because without that, it doesn't make sense. It will just be repetitive and getting all the good words that we want to hear, but it's not applied in the actual standards.
Thank you. Isa.
Yeah, thanks for all these great points. Just to respond to Alejandra, what you said about what is the best case scenario. I think there's no clear, best case scenario that we can refer to right now. It's really like picking and choosing from different practices, what we see, what emerges as potential best practice, and then combining that into really what I think should be a new standard, a new benchmark, but that doesn't exist right now. So that's, I think, on all of us to keep advocating in all of these different spaces. So within Article 6, but also outside of that, to kind of enforce this race to the top where we can build maybe something that at least is the best of the best combined. And I'm not saying like that's not an endorsement that it's good, but like you said, right now, a lot of it is the worst case scenario, and we need to desperately shift away from that. And then on Tom, on your point on who enforces FPIC, I think aside from what Nika has already said, another really important thing is the independent verification, and that's FPIC is also independently verified, and that's a really important element as well. That it's not just the same people who need the same people who are developing the project that are also deciding on whether FPIC is a go or a no go. So yeah, thanks.
Actually, I don't have any further to add, but just to also emphasize that when we talk about Article 6, it's not just about 6.2 and 6.4. There's also the Article 6.8, and I think as much as we focus on ensuring guardrail safeguards for communities affected by offset projects, we should also be looking at advancing our work and advocacy on ensuring that funds from POW solutions are diverted to real gender-based and people-driven real solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kwame, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very important for the UNFCCC to listen to the communities as well, because what happened before the Vaso commitments and what is happening after the Vaso commitment is the same. So I think we need to learn and listen, and it's very important to build more capacity for the government to understand also better, because some of the countries are just going for voluntary market without understanding the so what's intent into it. Just to close quickly, I think it's also very important to have the civil society organizations building more capacity for communities.
Thank you. And you get the last word, 1 minute. Thank you.
I think a good starting point is definitely having minimum standards that are very specific. But I think in terms of a best case scenario, it is very context specific. And sometimes it's very project specific, especially on issues like benefit sharing. But I think a good starting point is to have minimum standards nationally, internationally that are very specific.
Thank you so much. And we're already over time. So I just want to invite you to join me in a big applause to thank all of our speakers. Thank you so much.